there's always room for those sorts of experiences. Another good example are the CD-ROM games made by an artist named Teresa Duncan. From about 1995 to 98, Teresa Duncan made a bunch of CD-ROM games, Smarty, 00, and Chop Suey, that were targeted towards young girls ages about 8 to 12. That's an audience that there's not a lot of really substantive games for. You know, people, I can imagine, you know, somewhere in Activision were saying, we need a game for girls, Barbie Horse Adventure, just writing it off. But not that there's anything wrong with that, you know, different people like different things, but this is a game that, you know, starred intelligent girls going on adventures, and we're just something that doesn't really exist out there a lot. I was actually really happy they ran a Kickstarter recently to get these games re-released, and it was successful, so hopefully by the end of the year these games will be back in circulation. It's just an audience that you never really thought, you know, existed for games, but it totally does. You know, people make these things. And even more recently, games that are made in the narrative-based game engine Twine. If you haven't heard of it, it's a very simple, like, text-based game. You can make really short, interesting games. It's become a really important tool in interestingly the queer gaming scene, being, you know, kind of led in spirit by a trans developer named Anna Anthropy. And you can just make these quick, you know, one-off games that end up on social media and disappear a couple years later. But there's a lot of different perspectives happening, though, that we should be, you know, celebrating. Look, games can do this. We have games made by, was it freaks, normals, amateurs, artists, etc., etc. I think that's really exciting. We should be celebrating that instead of turning it away. But diverse representation, you know, it's good, but it's also part of the idea of cultivating a diversity of ideas and having all sorts of backgrounds and ideas present. Obscure games are often made by industry outsiders, people who, you know, made one game, didn't come back, didn't get into the whole AAA thing. And a lot of new and unconventional ideas come from that. Too often we just don't pay attention to. But it's worth playing them, it's worth taking a chance on their ideas and, you know, seeing what they come up with. One example I have here is a game called Evolva from 2000. It's a game by, interestingly, a group called Computer Artworks that did digital art software. So not at all sort of in the scene of, you know, what gaming conventionally is. It's an action RPG. You know, you go around, you slice people up, etc. The interesting twist is that instead of, you know, buying equipment or getting experience, you absorb the DNA from the enemies that you kill. So if you kill, you know, flying enemies, you might start to grow wings and run faster and jump higher. I think that's really clever. It's a little bit like Spore. In my opinion, almost a little more well executed just because it's a little more organic. It's a pretty clever idea to put on, you know, a genre that at this point is fairly well worn, and it came from a group that's very much on the periphery of gaming. You know, Evolva wasn't successful. I don't think Computer Artworks did another game after this. But it serves as a really interesting counterpoint to games like Spore or even things like Monster Rancher, as far as, you know, showing how to put ideas about like evolution into a game. It's a really neat idea. It's still kind of a traditional sort of game, though, you know, kind of the genres we're used to. But there are a lot of other games that really sort of push what can be considered a game. My favorite example of this is a game called Timothy Leary's Mind Mirror. Timothy Leary was a counterculture figure from the 1970s who was an advocate for LSD, so here we go. But he had a really interesting idea. It's a multiplayer psychology game, where at the start you describe, each person describes the person by picking adjectives, and then you go through life scenarios, and you have to pick actions not to, like, you know, win or whatever, but that best fit the psychological profile you had before. It makes you think a little more consciously about, you know, your own actions and your own psychological profile. That's awesome. That's just this crazy different idea that no one's ever attempted before. And it was from someone who was, you know, a significant figure that just decided to, you know, dip their toes into gaming. I'm not really surprised it wasn't successful. This is a really weird game. But it's, you know, it's something that we should be welcoming. There's still a chance to go back and explore and say, this is a really neat idea. This is worth trying out. You know, there's tons and tons of games coming up. I honestly don't think there's a big game from last year that had an idea as interesting as Mind Mirror, so it's worth going back and playing some of those games. There's so many, you know, these original diverse voices that remain in obscurity, and they just don't get attention. You know, the developers I mentioned earlier who make one-off games, they might withdraw from the industry in discouragement, or they might, you know, just give up on making their own big idea set. They might just be, you know, a level designer for Assassin's Creed 25 at some point, and abandon the idea of making these kind of big, giant games. Nothing wrong with Assassin's Creed, it's fun. But it's especially troubling when it's perspectives that aren't represented in gaming, like some of the ones I mentioned earlier. The thing is that all of these ideas, all of these voices exist, but to find them, sometimes you have to go a little off the beaten path. You know, maybe 20 years ago, it was a shareware CD. Maybe now it's something that's being done, you know, in the game jam right here. And that's where some of the new exciting voices of the next generation come from. So we should really be cultivating those because they give gaming, you know, new energy, new life, and new ideas. And you're going to find them when playing obscure, weird, and out-of-the-way games. What a great time. Marco Rubio thing. So one other thing I think is really great about obscure games is that they can illuminate and make us think more critically about what's the historical gaming canon. The history of a creative medium is rarely a linear thing. It's rarely, one thing is made, another thing is made, and it all branches from there. But in gaming, we always have this narrative that we tell ourselves. I'm sure you've seen this reinforced everywhere. Pong, Atari, Mario, the console wars. It's kind of the same linear story we tell ourselves about gaming. Even the big gaming history books, maybe you get like a Lara Croft in there or something. But it's very much the same sort of story we tell. The thing is, gaming's history is a lot deeper and more interesting than that. And I think we give it enough credit. There are huge amounts of gaming history that have been largely forgotten. And if you want to see what that is, if you want to enlighten ourselves about what gaming has to offer, you can find it in obscure games. Like for instance, the 80s, 90s, you think all the time about like the Nintendo and the Sega Genesis and things like that. But there were other systems like the MSX, the Pippin. Poor Pippin wasn't a great system, but they were out there and there were things happening on them. Or like early Windows games. One I want to focus on is the Mac gaming scene. It was sort of a joke for a while that the Macintosh didn't really have any games. But from when the first Mac Classic came out in '84 up until maybe about when Mac OS X came out, there was a really big Mac indie game scene that was making some really interesting things. They had their fair share of clone games, games like Pong and Pipe Dream clones. But they had a lot of really weird, interesting stuff too. There's like the action platformer Space Station Theta, pretty fun game. There was the RPG Taskmaker. Every time they say Taskmaker in the game, play that sound. But it's an RPG where it's like Ultima, and you get tasked with Taskmaker, and you kill them, and you become a Taskmaker, and it opens up modding tools. It's just a really interesting kind of RPG. Another RPG, Odyssey, The Legend of Nemesis. It's sort of like a parable-based game where each zone you enter is like a different conflict you have to solve a moral lesson. A really great game. There's Power Pete, which is sort of like Toy Story meets Contra. He plays a soldier who has to wander around through a toy store and like retrieve all the plush bunnies from like the evil things who are trying to fight them. Really weird game. There's Pararena, which I had to write down the note for this because I couldn't remember how I wanted to describe it. It's a punk sci-fi roller derby, air hockey, hoverboard, future sports semi-parody. It's really interesting. You roll around the thing, you shoot the ball back and forth. It's a lot of fun. It's a really neat game. There are local multiplayer games like Nuke Snake. It's kind of like Snake, but you can fire missiles and things blow up. It's like bouncing off the walls. There's 3 and 3, which is like a narrative meta puzzle game where it's like puzzles you solve, but it's based on the story of a number 3 who gets lost in a computer. Really weird ideas, but really neat. And also Koji the Frog. I just like this one. He plays a frog who eats bugs. It's just a fun little game. But I could have gone like on and on and on with those. But the reason I want to mention those is that there was a whole parallel game industry happening at the time. And some of those are from the 80s, some are from the 90s. We have no idea those happened. No one ever talks about them. It's almost entirely undocumented in the gaming discourse. So, playing obscurities like this makes you reevaluate to an extent, what you thought you knew about gaming history. Another great example is of a directly challenging gaming history is I want to talk about Myst for a second. I love Myst. Myst is the greatest. For those who don't know it, hopefully you guys know what it is, but if you don't, it was a CD-ROM game that came out in 1994. It was kind of the game that made people start thinking about games in terms of like being worlds instead of levels. It was a first-person adventure game, tons of video and stuff. Really revolutionary, but what's weird is that it was not the first game to do that by a long shot. Just in the 1 year before Myst came out, also saw the release of other games that did the exact same thing, including Return to Zork, The Chaos Continuum, Spaceship Warlock, and Iron Helix, and Quantum Gate. It's going to go on for a while. Lost in Time, which is actually by Muriel Kermesse, who I mentioned earlier. L-Zone, the German project. Can I come right here? Yeah. That is a great game. It's absolutely fantastic. So good. And Labyrinth of Time, squeaking in the last second. Finally made it. Finally got repetition. But the thing is, it's like Myst. Maybe why was it successful? Did it do something necessarily better than them on a technical level or an artistic level, or was it just like well timed? Was the market primed for a CD-ROM game at that point? We never really questioned that sort of thing, but knowing that there's 9 other games very much like Myst that came out around the same time, it makes us think a little more about why Myst was successful. It makes us think about gaming history a little more deeply. And even recent history tends to get written out. If you think about the early 2000s, you think about GameCube games, Luigi's Mansion, all that stuff. But there's a lot of other stuff happening. Like that was around the time that the seeds of the indie community were being planted. So there were some odd games like these ones, Blob Wars, Metal Blob Solid. Where did they get that name? That's so weird. It's actually pretty fun. It's like a Super Metro type game. And then Kiki the Nanobot, which is just this bizarre, like, three-dimensional gravity-shifting puzzle game. Really neat games we totally forgot about. In like sort of a parallel, again, like a parallel game industry happening. You know, we really don't know a lot about that. It's really underdocumented. So all of this said, I'm talking about all these great things that obscure games can do. There are some issues if we're trying to, you know, reinvigorate, not the game culture necessarily needs reinvigorating, but if we're trying to make things a little livelier with obscure games. The first big one I want to talk about is what I call the hipsters. I talked about obscurities as being a way to open the gaming discourse and making it so more people can get involved, talk about things they love, but it is really, really easy to accidentally make it even more niche and closed. A couple months ago, I was out of the bar talking with friends about Iron Helix, which I mentioned earlier. It's been a great time. Oh my gosh, it's a great game. It's like a 3D Pac-Man thing. It was a lot of fun. But I guarantee you, if there's someone in that group who did not know what Iron Helix was, I just would have alienated them completely. Like, it just would not have helped. It's really easy when you talk about these sort of things to create an echo chamber where only people who are in the know and, you know, in the loop can talk. And if we handle it right, it can make gaming, you know, a little unwelcoming and impenetrable. I call it the hipster's dilemma because of the, you know, you probably haven't heard of it before, quote. That's not what we want to do. We don't want that. It's really just the way we approach it. We have to come at it from a perspective of, you know, inviting people to discover these things instead of just trying to close people off from it. So it's less, you know, you haven't heard of this, and more, have you heard about this? You know, getting people to appreciate these weird things, saying, you should give this a try, as opposed to, well, you've never played, you know, the Labyrinth of Time, you're an asshole. Like, that's not the way to do it. That's not good. So it's about sharing and not judging. And the other big one, this is a big thing, I think, is the role of privilege. And what I mean by that is that gaming takes on a lot of technical skills and effort to be involved in. If it's something that's on a computer, especially if it's an older game, and especially if it's something that's not, you know, readily available or less well known, it can be difficult. You know, not everyone has the time or the resources or research skills or technical know-how to find and play a lot of these weird out-of-the-way games. That's not anyone's fault. I'm not saying, you know, people should be like feeling guilty about this or something, but it just means that people from different backgrounds will have an easier or harder time doing this sort of thing. Myself, I'm a white guy. I grew up in the early 90s next to a library that had a large game collection. My family was pretty well off and tech friendly. We had a bunch of consoles and computers. I lived next to a game rental store. You know, I'm really familiar with what was going on in the landscape at the time. I have all these resources I look at. That means it's going to be a lot easier for me to do this sort of thing. If you're someone who's only just come into gaming, you know, it's going to be harder for you to get involved in that, and that's unfortunate. That sucks. It's not really fair. So I think what needs to happen is that everyone who can do this sort of thing should be making it easier for everyone who can't do this sort of thing. You know, if you do enjoy weird out-of-the-way games, share the experiences, talk about them, put up guides for people using emulators, make it easier for people to get in on this, because it means everyone can start sharing these experiences a little more, instead of, you know, if you're someone who just came in today and said, I want to play, you know, the Journeyman project, it would be a little harder for you to do that, but you just make it a little more accessible by sharing it with as many people as possible. The good news is it is getting easier. There's increasingly websites and resources like GOG, the Internet Archive, studios like Night Dive that are republishing old games, even things like the PS1 Classics program that Sony's doing are just making these weirder out-of-the-way games a little more accessible. The Internet Archive put up 2,300 DOS games on their website a while ago. That's amazing! Like, you can play those on any browser, like on any mobile device. That's great, that's so exciting. We should be pushing for more sort of that kind of thing, you know.
Are they getting any takedown notices for that?
Say again?
Are they getting any takedown notices for those?
I've noticed the number of games slowly declining over the last couple of days, but a lot of it's freeware, and people that, you know, abandonware stuff, so I think a lot of it's going to stay up. But, you know, some stuff's going to be lost forever, like Windows 95 or 98 games, just because it's difficult to play, but we should be working towards making them more accessible. And for more recent stuff, there's sites like Rock, Paper, Shotgun, and other discussion sites that are doing a good job pulling out these unusual games and highlighting them. PC Gamer used to have a feature called Saturday Crapshoot, where they would just pick some weird-ass, crazy old game and play it, and that exposed it to a lot more audience, and people really enjoyed that. We should be, you know, encouraging that sort of thing. But the most important thing, I think, is that it's fun. I've talked a lot about games being cultural objects so far. It's important to, you know, compare and contrast, you know, other games and their place in gaming culture. That's not something we should ignore. But they aren't just abstract, you know, games are meant to be played. They are very, very fun. You know, out-of-the-way games can be genuinely great. I talked a little earlier about, you know, how there's sort of the presumed meritocracy that games that aren't as well known aren't celebrated that much. But there's a lot of examples that prove that wrong. One of them right here, I have this one right here. It's a game called Mission Force Cyberstorm. It's a strategy game by Sierra from Oh, 96, okay. It's sort of like XCOM in a lot of ways, in that it's a very tight game where, you have like one split decision could destroy your entire team, you command a big army. In this case, it's an army of giant robots. Awesome! But there's also some other interesting wrinkles, in addition to the robots, you have pilots that have to control them, that have, different skill levels, and they can age so they'll lose their skills, and there's this really dark, sci-fi, mysterious plot of private military contractors. It is a really fantastic game. I seriously think it's one of the best strategy games ever made. No one has ever heard of it, and that should change. And there are some really genuinely great games like that are just kind of on the periphery that we don't hear about. Another good example is this game called Life and Death by Software Toolworks. You might know Software Toolworks from their classic games, Mario is Missing and Mario's Time Machine. This is much better. This is sort of their magnum opus. In this game, you play as a surgeon who works at a hospital, and you have to deal with patients who come in, treating them, diagnosing them. You might give them medicine, you might refer them to a urologist or something, but once in a while, you have to do surgery. This game is really realistic, and not in the sense that it's like gritty or dark, or like people swear a lot, but in the sense that it's incredibly detailed and accurate. Like before you do a surgery, you have to put on the anesthetic, wash your hands, put gloves on, do an antiseptic wash in their body, put down a coat on it, and then go. It doesn't tell you this, you just gotta figure this out. It is incredibly detailed, almost sickening sometimes in its detail. That one. It's a shame it's black and white. It's one of the old DOS games, it's only blue and red, so it's not popping through very well, but it's really detailed, it's really something. The manual actually has a big note that's like, this game is not medical training, which they needed that. It's really detailed and involved, it's crazy. It's something that really needs to be played to be experienced. And I'm not talking about these games individually to promote them. I love Mission 4 Cyberstorm, and there's any number of games that could have used as examples. But it's just because there is real, true hidden greatness out there that's waiting to join into gaming culture and the conversation. I really wanted to dispel the idea that obscure games tend to be novelties, that it's some weird game someone likes, okay, that's cute, that's great. There are some really good ones out there that are worth discovering and playing. I think besides just playing them, the act of finding them, digging them up, and sharing them can be a lot of fun. I think curiosity can be its own reward, even if the games themselves aren't that great. Sometimes, especially if the games aren't that great. I have a couple really horrible games I want to talk about for a second. The first one's an arcade game called Dino Rex. It plays as terribly as it looks. You play as dinosaurs who attack each other, there's like one sound effect. It's just a disaster. Just worth playing, but hilarious. There's this game for the Atari called Manja. You play as a kid whose mom is force-feeding him spaghetti. And instead of eating it, you have to feed it to the dog or the cat outside. Like, what were they thinking? Like, what the hell is that? It's an insane game. But it's hilarious. Like, it's absolutely worth playing just because of this dumb, horrible thing. There's this game called Animal. I know, it's an advertisement game in which you play a piece of spiced meat. It's like, it's just a disaster. I don't know how anyone approves of it. And then there's this game here. I bought a copy of it called Angst Ross's Revenge. This is the worst game I've played in my entire life. Like sub-big rigs over the road racing level. That's a bold claim. It is hard. This is the best screenshot I could get. It's the most terrible game in the world. Like after playing it, I liked other games less from it. It was like, oh my god, this game is terrible, but for reasons that are fundamental to all games. Like it was just, it was the worst thing. But here's the thing though, like, I unironically love these games. Like, they're terrible, but I'm happier for having played them because, the act of finding them and looking up and getting them, playing them, being horrified by them, and then getting to share them with, poor suckers like you guys is so much fun. It's so enjoyable. Going back to Manja for a second, Mike Micah, he's the chief creative officer at Other Ocean Interactive. They came out with the iDar game that's coming out soon. Yeah. Manja is one of his favorite games ever. He owns 2 copies of it. He thinks it's hilarious. Just because it's crazy, and he likes sharing it with people and getting their reactions. It's fun to play some of these crappier games. If honestly, gun to the head, if I had to choose between only playing new, boring games for the rest of my life or getting to find a million Angst Ross's Revenges, I would totally take the terrible games just because it's fun to find them and play them and share them with people. And to me, there's a lot of merit to that. So there's just a lot of stuff to be discovered out there, whole genres, some peculiar favorites you might like. To borrow a concept that's discussed about in library science, I'm a librarian by trade, so it's the idea that there's something for everyone, but there's also someone for everything. in that there's a lot of games out there that are waiting to be discovered and played and enjoyed, but there's also people who are looking for that right game that they really want to sink their teeth into and love, and a lot of those, might have been things that just slipped through the cracks and weren't as well known. Myself, I love CD-ROM games. That's my thing. I'm totally obsessed with them. There's a lot out there to play that was totally undocumented, and no matter what, your favorite genre or era or anything like that is, there's a lot waiting for you. If you guys use the website Moby Games, it's sort of like the IMDb of games. They have games with screenshots and credits and information about them. I looked up their statistics a while ago, and at last count, there were 91,000 games on that site. If you played one game every day to have gotten done, you would have to have started during the French and Indian War. There are an absurd number of games out there waiting to be enjoyed, and of those ones, 84% don't have reviews on them. There's so much out there waiting to be discovered and enjoyed. Everyone should just dive in and have fun with that. So at the start of the presentation, I asked you to imagine what gaming culture would look like, if it would look better, if we started to enjoy some of these obscure and out-of-the-way games. And I touched on some of the positive points. That it challenges the consensus opinion that tends to dominate, discussion in gaming communities. It helps us build empathy with people who enjoy them. It encourages diverse representation and ideas. It deepens our understanding of gaming history, and it's fun. And there is an example of this happening in practice I want to talk about. It's a game, hopefully some guys heard of it, it would be great, called Eastern Mind and the Lost Souls of Tom New. This is a crazy game. It's an adventure game from 1994 by a guy named Osamu Sato, who's a video artist who got a grant to make a game. It was published by Sony. It's a game in which he plays a man who loses his soul and has to retrieve it. So he goes to the island of Tom New and has to solve the mysteries there. And he has to live the life of each of the inhabitants of the island to get a full understanding of how it works. The game is also completely nuts, just ridiculous. The island of Tom New, if you can see in the box, it's just a giant green head. It's not even an island. It's completely insane. The characters look like Jello with bedazzles on them. It's just completely insane. The island, the paths cross in and out of each other. It's super non-linear. The writing just feels totally off. There's a character who's obsessed with New Year's Day. It's just this whacked out game. But it's very clear that's exactly what the guy who made it meant. He wanted to make this totally crazy game. But once you get beyond the crazy the mountains with eyeballs on them and stuff, once you get beyond that, it's really it's sort of a Zen parable type game. He tried to put some Eastern philosophy stuff into it. It's very much a game about reincarnation and finding meaning in your life, and not just retrieving your soul, but also using it and having meaning in it. The best example of this I can talk about is there's a part of the game where there's an area called the Helix Palace, totally optional area, again, bonkers game, where you can find different areas of different, otherworldly pleasures, you can eat so much food that you die, stuff like that. And there's this one room where you can find this item called the moon water that makes you, immortal. And what's fascinating is you don't win the game if that happens. The game ends if you become immortal. And it just cycles through every single screenshot and piece of text and icon in the game, because the only way to win is to, experience all these lives and die and be reincarnated. So if you're immortal, you lose. It's a really bold statement about life and death and the meaning of that. In this game, death is sort of like a punctuation mark, and it's the end of one experience, the beginning of another, and it's not a punishment. It's really, it's Buddhist philosophy being put into the design of the game, and that's awesome. That's a really and unique perspective that it's out there. It's weird. Again, we got the eyeballs everywhere, but it's a really neat perspective you don't see represented in a lot of games. So the story I want to talk about is sort of how it became repopularized in the last couple of years. It came out, it was not super successful, super obscure. It actually had a sequel that was even less well known. Whole other story of that. Someone finally got a copy, which is amazing. Flash forward a decade, I'm in college, freshman year of college, I refine the game, I need to share this with people. So I just do a little bit, I make a blog post, I put up a YouTube video. Years pass, somehow the right person finds it, and things just take off. People start doing Let's Plays. It ends up in sites like Cracked, Hardcore Gaming 101, Complex, Killscreen. People just start writing about it. Someone finally put up a GameFAQs entry for it. It's this totally unknown game that all of a sudden is being entered back into the discourse as being, it's there was nothing written about this game a couple years ago, and all of a sudden now people are starting to enjoy it again, which is really exciting. But I think more than it becoming well known, the really exciting part is that there's been a community forming around it. You can see someone did a charity fundraiser, that someone's selling art on Etsy for the game. That's incredible. It's on TV Trope, there's fan art tumblers. It's starting to grow. People are enthusiastically loving the game and appreciating Osamu Sato's vision for it. And it's just this happy, welcoming community that's forming. And what I think is even more exciting than just being a happy community is that it's one that other people are building from the ground up. No one really had a claim to this game before because no one really knew about it. And so from the get-go, people are engaging in a new culture and building it up. It's really inclusive, all sorts of people participating. It makes me so happy. Like, nothing but positivity has come out of the Eastern Mind community now. From this game that, even 7 years ago, no one had any idea existed, and that's now become this focal point for people who are really enjoying it. I think that's a really great example in practice of, the whole process of obscure games, celebrating the unusual perspective, changing gaming history a little bit, letting people with different interests participate. It's just a fantastic example. And so what I really wanted to ask was, what if everyone who was in that Eastern Mind community took something away from that experience? That obscure games can be fun, that we should be looking to out-of-the-way things. We should listen to people when they ramble about their weird, bizarre game that they enjoy. And take it a little more seriously. I think maybe there's some merit to it. I think that's why obscurity is really matter. They're fun games and they have a lot of merit, but if we reach out for them a little more and start to practice enjoying them a little bit, it can really lead to a better and more inclusive gaming culture, which is fantastic thing. Before I end, I did have one example I wanted to talk about that I couldn't really fit into the rest of the presentation. I didn't really have space for it, but it's MAGFest. I wanted to talk about a music game, so what the hell. It's a game called SimTunes that came out, there we go, in 1996. It's really cool. It was by a guy named Toshio Iwai. It's sort of like a musical toy box game, a little bit like Mario Paint. It was actually developed as a Super Nintendo game called Sound Fantasy, and Nintendo declined it. Evidently, they regretted their decision because years later they went back to this guy, Toshio Iwai, and asked him to make Electroplankton. So there's that recurring theme again about some of the the interesting ideas coming from weird, out-of-the-way games, and SimTunes is a great example. How it works is that you paint a picture with colors, and then you have musical instrument bugs that crawl all over, and they make songs based on it. So you can make little geometric things, or you can just make a whole mess of whatever, or you can make little paintings that they move around, they play music for them. It's really neat. It's kind of a fun little creativity tool, and I think you've seen people recently making all sorts of things with Mario Paint. I think we should totally enter into the conversation. It's a weird game that it's part of the Sim series. It's kind of weird, but it's something we should be going back to and saying, this is pretty good. We should be celebrating this. This is great. So just for demonstration purposes, I did put together a little one just to show you how it works. You may be familiar with the song. Which it sounds like I'm just going to cut that off. I don't want to listen to the rest of that. But it's this interesting weird game that just people didn't know about. It's worth going back and playing. There is merit to those sort of old weird, out-of-the-way games. So that's really all I have to say. I think it's worth going back to these games, not just for the merits of the fun that's with them, but also just because of the positive effects they can have when you listen to other people and in gaming culture and listen to what they have to say, listen to different perspectives. It makes it better. Just flat out, it's a good thing. So now I'm ready to answer questions if anyone has any questions. Here's my contact info. Hit me up on all the things. There's also at the bottom, there is a download code for one free copy of The Labyrinth of Time on GOG. Please get it. It's great. It's wonderful. I want everyone to play this. But yeah, questions. You have your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah. So, are you familiar with any commercial or promotional obscure games? One that was mine I remember playing was from the makers of Chex Mix. I'm wondering if you have more examples of those kinds of things.
They're commercials in advertisement type games?
Yes.
My favorite example of that is a game called Duracell Run the Button that was made by Duracell. It is so much worse than you think. So the game itself is you just wander around and there's bunnies you hit and colors happen and there's little shapes you hit. It's terrible, it makes no sense, there's no story. Here's what's more weird. I got in touch with the guy who made it, and he intended to be a psychological profiling game. Because at the end you get a code where it's I couldn't be, it's impossible, I don't know how I'm get to the end of it, but you get a little code, it's send this code and you'll get free batteries. But the code also includes which objects and colors you touch, because he was trying to see what consumers' interests are. If they're more toward light colors or dark colors for advertising purposes. That's evil. That's terrible. It's hilarious. It's such a weird thing. There's so much stuff that was just made for examples for just advertising. It's a dark world. There is that stuff out there. It's like a lot of licensed games too. Some of them are okay. There's nothing wrong with licensed games, but I can't think of everything off the top of my head. But the Duracell one, look it up, just vomit and don't play it. But like I said earlier, it's fun. It's worth trying out. You and Henry first. In the ground.
So one of my favorite games as a kid was Uncle Albert's Magic Album, which is really obscure.
Oh yeah.
And so I tried getting it to work again, and everything that I've tried doesn't work. And so I've been trying to research how do I get it working again.
Yeah.
Is there like a central hub where people, a big forum where people come together to try and get old games working again?
It's not, and that's sort of the problem. Is it maybe like a DOS game? Is that like the?
It's actually in between DOS and.
That's the problem. That's the thing. It's like because there is a way you can like use old Windows things in DOSBox. You can use like a virtual machine to run Windows 95. There's just not a lot of documentation out there for it. That's a lot of the problem. No one's really coming together to discuss that sort of thing. I think that's one of the big barriers. Like Mission 4 Cyberstar I mentioned, this thing like barely runs on any computer now because it's so dependent on like FMVs and such. It's a problem that like a lot of those games are just kind of in that gray area. There's no community. Like there's people tripping over themselves to make the most accurate Super Nintendo emulator. No one's made a Pikmin emulator. I mean, so I think it's a shame though. I think those games are lost, and there should be a bigger effort. The answer is there's not, and that sucks, and it's not there. Go for it, Dave.
Have you ever heard of Master Lou?
Say again?
Master Lou.
Master Lou, I have not.
Okay, it's like a super old PC like pointing. Like it's like Myst and that sort of stuff. I just wanted to say because if you didn't hear it, I was going to suggest.
That would be on my radar,
Yeah.
Mr. Lou. Okay.
I think it's on Good Old Games, but I don't know.
Okay.
It might be like one of those things that's impossible to run because it's like based on
That has never stopped me. I will jot it down. I'll see what happens. I have a ton more. I'll see if it can reach out or something. But I'll look into it. Mr. Lou. Okay. Cool. You're up there.
Me?
If I'll go to people back, yeah. Go for it.
I was wondering if you could suggest a good way to get an obscure game. If you go and walk to the bargain bin, there's 1,000 games. Or if you go onto, one of the DOS sites, there's a million. How do you pick? Where do you start?
That's a really good question. Honestly, like I mentioned Rock, Paper, Shotgun earlier, a lot of review sites are where I start for a lot of places. I'll admit sometimes just going through Moby Games and just grabbing a billion things and trying them. But like, for example, there was a site called Tap Repeatedly that a lot of the older games... Really? Really? Oh, that's awesome. I use you guys all the time. You guys wrote about a lot of like weird out of the way like adventure game stuff, and that's where I found a lot of it. So there you go. That's the point. Sharing, people start to learn about it. So I would say find people who write about it and share that sort of thing. And they'll probably share their favorite stuff, and that's a good place to start. But yeah, in the back.
How do you feel about Twitch's and YouTube's role in bringing obscure games forward? Do you think they've done a good job, or would you want more from it?
Definitely a good job. I mean, there's always the the implementation problem. I tried the other day. I'm gonna admit I did a speedrun for Labyrinth at the time. Probably the only person in the world who's tried that. I'm such a winner. But I couldn't figure out how to get Twitch to work with DOSBox. So there might be like a little accessibility barrier there, but I think it's done a huge job. Like I was mentioning with Eastern Mind, Let's Plays are really one of the reasons it took off. Or even who's the guy Vine Sauce? They do a lot of like weird bargain bin stuff. I know, right? Oh my god. He does a lot of weird bargain bin stuff, and that gets it on people's radar. So I think it's done a huge role. People like just streaming little games. It helps a lot. It really helps because that's what people are looking.
I would say his website, Electron Dance, is good too. They're friends with Tab Repeatedly, and he discovers obscure old and new games all the time.
Electron Dance, okay. Electron Dance.
They're in our network. The Alliance of Awesome. So we post for him and they post for us.
Okay, cool. Again, importance of sharing. Yeah. You, sir.
How do we deal with copyright law vis-a-vis a lot of these old games?
That is a problem and a good question. No, it's seriously a problem though. A lot of these games aren't released. Eastern Mind, this is my bragging but also been shameful. Buying this game now, this box game would cost $500. That's ridiculous. That is stupid. No one should have to pay that much for a game. The reason a lot of people have started playing it is because it's going around in circles like Soviet sound stuff. It's like getting circulated. Unfortunately, at this point in time, piracy is kind of like the I don't want to say chaotic good. That's not true. But it's the kind of bad thing that you have to temper or align yourself with just to get these things known. I'm against piracy for more well-known. For current games, things that are still being sold, terrible. But for a lot of this older stuff, I'll admit to having to find ISOs or abandonware and stuff like that. it's unfortunate, and that sucks, and that's why I think, we need to be pressuring a lot of publishers and whatnot to get their games out there a little more, to say, there's some merit in getting this back out there, you can get money from it. It's a shame, but right now, piracy is kind of it's what we have to work with right now. It's a shame, but it's how it goes. Oh, go for it.
I was wondering if there's a difference between so bad it's good and just bad. Because I have a lot of friends who love watching obscure, terrible movies.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But sometimes that just leaves you drained and miserable. So how do you go about finding good it's bad?
So good it's bad?
So bad it's good.
I think a lot of it is really the context. Like Angst I mentioned earlier, I would not recommend that anyone play this game in their life. It is the most depressing thing in the world. But the reason I enjoyed it was that I got to talk about it and tell people about it. I got to say, you've got to see this game, this is the worst thing ever. My roommate from earlier is here. He saw me going through the stages of grief as I dealt with this game. It was fun and enjoyable, so I think even the worst thing like that, if you cushion it, I would not recommend someone play it. I beat this game, I did not enjoy that, but even just popping in briefly and seeing it, it's possible to have fun with a little bit of it. For something, it feels bad sometimes with, cutting out a movie 10 minutes into it. Games, I'm sure there's even great games we all haven't finished. So there's nothing wrong with popping into a game saying, this is terrible, did you see this? Oh my god, and then going on to something better. It at least gives it a little bit of value, contextualized like that.
I do video game reviews on my YouTube channel.
Okay.
I do console games though.
All right, yeah.
Could you recommend a good console game that's obscure?
Oh, that's a good question. It's tough for me because I feel like there's so much console stuff out there that's going to crawl over so well. There's here we go with the piracy stuff, like the good set ROMs that are out there. People know everything. So it's difficult to really find something that's not super well known. If I'm going for personal favorites, the game Illusion of Gaia from the Super Nintendo is one of So that's really good, but a lot of the games by lesser known publishers, stuff that was made in America that got some weird label, so not the big Square Enix. There are games Live a Live or something that didn't make it stateside that people love talking about. They're the weirder ones. It's so fun to share. It's great. But some of the weirder out of stuff. But I think there was a game that was terrible. It's called Fun and Games. It was a Mario Paint clone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not super great, but it was made by a publisher and a developer I've never heard of. So there's look for things from developers and publishers you have no idea who they are. I think it's the start for that. Just because the bigger known companies, it's just a lot of well-covered material. Also, one more thing actually, PlayStation 1, lots of PlayStation 1 stuff. That was a dark era for just strange games coming out. Intelligent Cube, that game is crazy. It's a puzzle game with cubes rolled down at you. It's really dark and ominous, level 1. It's this but it's totally worth playing. So a lot of weird PS. There's a game called Spider.
Expensive.
Yeah, that's the problem I mentioned that earlier. For the PS1 Classic, making it easier. There's a game called Spider where he plays a spider. It's whatever. But there's PS1. I think those CD-based games. There's a lot of stuff to cover too. You were next to me.
Do you do much with homebrew, ROM hacks, stuff like that that are just kind of fun, mixed created stuff?
I thought about it, but at least on my blog, my stuff, I tend to deal with some of the older stuff. There is a lot of weird, people are still making Genesis games, which is crazy. I want to expand a little bit, but just for my own purposes, I'm doing a lot of older stuff. But even that newer stuff is worth sharing and talking about. Even with the things I do talk about, there is thinking about old Windows 3.1 shareware games made by one person in their basement. A great example I had from the presentation was a game called Palace of Deceit. It's a first-person adventure, kind of a fantasy storybook. It was made by Cliff Bleszinski. There's all these weird games made by people. We've never heard of these games before. So there's not exactly homebrew, but there's a lot of stuff kind of in the same vein, one-person projects out there. But I would absolutely consider homebrew stuff to be part of the same family, definitely. Way in the back. Yes, you.
I was at a panel earlier where they were talking about preservation when it comes to console games.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of the focus was on the hardware, the physical media, and there's sort of a sense in that community that, ROMs, if we can say ROMs, that's the best we can do, then I guess that's something. Do you think preservation of some of this obscure stuff and the sort of the broad range of what's still available for computer games, does that benefit from the fact that we've only just seen it in terms of sort of bits on a disc?
I think it has helped to an extent. The fact that all these games are digital, and rippable, even though that's, don't want to encourage piracy, but I think that has helped a lot. There are some sites, I don't want to talk about them here, that I occasionally go to get some of the weirder out of the way stuff people are compiled. They're just the only place you can find anyone even mentioning or having it. It's the fact that a lot of these games are born digital has really helped in terms of preservation. I have an old copy of SimCity. I think the discs are dead by now. It was probably a little hard to rip that. But a lot of the CD-ROM stuff, since it was something that, it's a digital file, put it into a computer, it's a lot easier to like rip it and put an ISO somewhere. I think that has helped a lot for preservation. There has been a little less concerted preservation effort for some of the weird unknown stuff like this for obvious reasons. But I think when that does happen, it might be a little easier just because of the fact that it was made on a computer for a computer. Yes. You again, sir, go for it.
Play devil's advocate for a moment. Do you think there are some games that aren't worth saving or are not worth remembering?
That's a very good question. My immediate reflex, and I hate this, was something like the yearly iteration of sports games. But that's not a fair judgment. People still enjoy the game. That's not a fair judgment. As things that shouldn't be saved, is there interesting? I can't think of a lot off the top of my head. The only thing I can think of would be some of the compilation discs that are out there. Shareware CDs have been really useful for me finding a lot of stuff. But for example, there's a PS1 game that was released exclusively at Pizza Hut. That was just 4 demos, and then the rest of it was 30 minutes of Pizza Hut ads. I'm not 100% sure there's a lot of merit in that. I still think it should be preserved. Since, again, I work in a library and getting my MLS right now, I'm super in favor of preservation and everything like that. But some of that stuff like that, if we lost all the Pizza Hut games, it wouldn't be the worst thing. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Oh, yeah.
Do you think something like Steam would start picking up some of these old games? Because I was thinking, there was one day I was just looking to see, I was not expecting to find it, but I was looking for I Had No Mouth and I My Screen.
It's on there, yeah.
I know, I was so surprised. And I was just like, okay, well, if this is here, then what else is?
It is.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier Night Dive Studios. They're a group that goes around and picks up the copyrights for a lot of things that have kind of fallen by the wayside. And they've been restreamed. They got Rabbit of the Time on Steam. They put a lot of weird stuff on Steam. They got System Shock back on Steam.
Yeah.
Not an obscure game by any means, but they're the ones who are doing that. You're seeing it a lot. German Project, got the mug right here, I got to promote them. They have a greenlight going on right now. They asked me to mention it. This is actually a good plug for it. I know, but there is an interest from a lot of those publishers. Social media is helping reconnect and see there are people who still like these things, and it's helping get them out. So absolutely, digital distribution is a really important platform for getting some of these games well known again. Super happy about that. Yes, sir.
As someone with a blog, how easy do you find it to get in touch with some of the developers of the games from the
Surprisingly easy a lot of the time, because these are people who aren't in the game industry anymore. A lot of these people, one of them, writes I think there is a game called Gravity Balls. It's this weird Mac game with physics and screaming constantly. It's really weird. He writes poker software now. He's just some guy doing something else. He was like, "You knew about this? Oh my God, that's great!" If you find an email, they will probably respond to you. It's because again, it's a lot of people, especially for some of the older, weirder stuff, who have largely withdrawn and are happy to hear from it. Pickle Wars earlier, I got in contact with Karen Croker. She was like, "Wow, Pickle Wars, that's great!" Wrote a whole email about how wonderful Pickle Wars was in the process of it. So a lot of these people are as excited to talk about these games as I am, and that makes me really happy. That to remind them that there is an audience for this. There are people who want to play these sorts of things, and it really encourages them. And even with a lot of the re-releases, it encourages them to get back into the marketplace and give it another shot, which is the best possible thing, I think. Yeah.
I know, especially movie tie-in video games tend to get a bad rap, especially in the earlier era. Are there any good obscure movie gems?
Movie tie-in games. I gotta think about this. I usually don't play a whole lot. I think about this is sort of a cop-out answer, but it's so relative. I think about when I was a kid, I had the A Bug's Life game. I loved the A Bug's Life game on PlayStation. It's not good, but that's the thing. It's if we go with an open mind and say maybe there's something in this game we can enjoy it a little bit. So I'm trying to think of a specific answer to give you about good movie tie-in games. No, absolutely not. Nothing is coming to mind right now.
Spider-Man 2?
That. There was, though, kind of entertainingly, there were 3 completely different versions of Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. At least one of them has to be good. Something that's worth trying. That's the only one coming out right now. I can't think of an answer, sorry, but... We're talking obscure. We're talking like Niagara for the Tiny Little Games right now. Go back.
There's Lego Harry Potter and like Lego Star Wars.
Those are good.
Which is like a reference to a reference.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with adaptations per se. Do you right there?
Do you know anything about like old like RPG maker games? Like I think there was a scene for that like in the 90s.
Oh yeah, that's the thing is a lot of those kind of thing with the homebrew stuff. A lot of those games that came out of like the early like someone who just found RPG maker games. Again, there's not a lot of effort put into collecting them really and preserving them. There is a lot out there. There was a game I really enjoyed. It was made in the Games Factory, the game making program called Mr. Pineapple. It's like someone just like vomited onto a screen. It's just, but I love it. It's like this crazy game made by someone with like no experience or anything like that. Like, this is great. And there's no effort really to collect them or do anything like that. So like there is a scene for that, or even like what was the OHR RPG making engine from years ago. I was briefly involved in that community. There's totally room for that out there, but no one's put the effort into collecting it, which is a shame. But it sure should be. Yeah.
So that actually reminds me of, so Newgrounds is turning 20 soon. And so
tomorrow, right, or something?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you've got all these old Flash games, and everybody, at least that I knew in middle school, there was that phase in which, like, I want to make a Flash game.
Oh, yeah.
So you've got all these Flash games in the portal and in Newgrounds, and they are archived. But there's no real way of discovering them other than clicking a button 80 billion times.
Yeah, I mean,
how would you find those?
Again, I think a lot of it comes back to just having the people who know about it and enjoying it being vocal. You know, there is an audience for a lot of stuff. I'm sure there's some who like loves Newgrounds games like a spreadsheet, the ones they enjoy and whatnot. They've got to share that stuff. I mean, there is an audience for that sort of thing. I mean, you know, maybe like Mario Breakdancing 3 wasn't the greatest game in the world or something. I'm pretty sure that existed too. But there is an audience, so I think it's getting the people who are, there are people who are invested in that, getting them out there and realizing there is an audience for this sort of thing and getting them to participate in making it so everyone can get involved with it. You know, I have my master terrible list of like thousands of games I need to go through, and I'm slowly trying to work through it and push them to get them out there. Like, I think everyone who knows about that stuff should be talking to other people about it. In the back, to Ty.
Yeah, so you were talking about preservation of games and trying to decide.
Yeah.
So it kind of reminded me of E.T. for the Atari 2600. I don't know if you mentioned that earlier.
That jerk there just screwed it out.
Yeah, but I was wondering if, you know, what do you think that we would need to preserve that game to show later game developers, hey, you shouldn't make a game that is total garbage, or should we just, do you think that we burying all these copies in the ground so there's no knowledge?
I think everything has at least some contextual cultural value. You know, in the library world, you're just often reading through and getting rid of books. The stuff to get rid of is like encyclopedias from 1984. I mean, that's just, there's not a whole lot of effort in that. But I think even the worst or weirdest stuff out there, at least, will have some merit to someone. Someone's going to find something interesting and useful in it. And you know, I think if that stuff is lost, what was a good example? Someone said that was like 80% of all silent films are lost, just gone, just like decayed or thrown away. Like, maybe there was something really great there. We have no idea. And, you know, I would fear something like that happening with, like, games from Windows 95. Like, you know, even the weird stuff, like if Mission 4 Cybertron goes to the wayside, you know, the world wouldn't blink, but I think people are missing out on something great. So even if it's something that isn't necessarily the greatest thing, I think there's at least a little merit to everything as far as having some cultural analysis value. And I think it would be a shame if something that got lost. Yeah? One question?
How do you feel about privilege in the sense for board games?
For board, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about these.
Because those also have very good design aspects behind them, and in the current time, computer science is very accessible to everybody. So you have a bunch of these new indie games coming out as well. But for board games, you need plastic, you need all this stuff, more than just design. You need physical, tangible pieces
to actually make them.
To make a game.
And also the issue of just being ridiculously expensive. What was it? I purchased Rampage recently. Really fun game. Probably hilariously illegal. Just the name of it. But it was like $60. It's ridiculous. And something that I think I think people are realizing there's ways to make things quicker. Like there's a lot of paper prototype stuff, like people just making games using like quarters and notebook paper, which isn't, you know, the ideal way to play a lot of stuff. But I think as far as making games, it's gotten more accessible. You know, there's a lot of game jams where people, you know, will make physical games and they'll just take a piece of construction paper and like borrow figures from Risk and make something. A few friends of mine a while ago made a version of Settlers of Catan with Risk pieces. We just like totally changed the rules and made like armies, and it ended up being more like Civilization than Settlers of Catan. Basically, made our own board game just by like taking pieces of other stuff. So I think the barrier there is getting lower and lower, which is great. I think the bigger barrier is really when you hear about something, getting to play it. Just, you know, there's places like, you know, here you can go there's board game bars and such, but not everyone has access to that. So I think the getting to play them is a much bigger issue than getting to be involved in like making them and such. Sir.
Hi.
Yeah.
I have a question. Maybe some of these games, like they're getting dark because they're bad. It's sort of like conventional ways that we like to talk about games. Do you think we need ways to talk about these obscure games that highlight these qualities that they might have that might not be evident if you look at it at first glance? Like from outside, you look at it like, oh, this looks like a simple game. There's a bad graphics. There's one of these ways that we usually do. Do we need other ways to talk about these games?
I think so. I think that's just, you know, slowly growing the gaming discourse and getting people talking a little more intellectually about games than sometimes. Not that I know gaming discourse isn't, you know, intellectual level right now, but just getting people to acknowledge design aspects a little bit. There's a game I played called Elvis in Space. It's a mess. It's like you're in a spaceship and you have to find Elvis. You have to like retrieve the magic peanut butter sandwich. It's just so weird. But the more I played it, I realized it had like so much more in common with like FTL than I expected. There's like a lot of simulation aspects, and so I was like, you know what? This isn't a great game, but they really tried to put a lot of thought into the design of this. So I think it's getting past the dichotomy of, you know, games being intrinsically good or bad, and people like what they like. That's a whole separate thing. But getting to appreciating games, you know, kind of on design terms and taking little bits and pieces from them. I feel like with a lot of big games, people do that sometimes. Like, oh, you know, this game was good. There's an element of this. With a lot of the older games, I think they should, you know, get the same courtesy of, you know, saying maybe it's not great, but there could be something good within it we can look for. And I think we're almost out of time.
Sorry, you're touching on the preservation of games.
Yeah.
What about how often are we able to preserve the source code?
Good question. Not really. What was an example was Jordan mentioned the guy who made Prince of Persia just found the source code of Prince of Persia like sitting in a box somewhere. I think for newer games it's a little easier, but for a lot of the older stuff, people didn't think there was room for that. You know, games were still just a novelty at the time. So for a lot of, like, what was the Journeyman project? There were 2 versions of the original game, one of which was like a fancy one, all CGI elements. That's the one that's getting re-released. The older one was done in Macromedia Director, which was like sort of like, you know, the navigational program thing. There's no way that's ever going to be re-released just because no one ever thought it was worth going back and saving the source code, especially like you know, a movie tie-in game. Who would have thought like, oh yeah, this will be valuable, we should save this one day. It was intended for kids, like no one ever thought to it. So for older stuff, it sucks, but not really. For newer stuff, I think there's a concerted effort. People realize it's important. I think one more question, if anyone has one.
I was just wondering on the flip side, you talked about bringing people from outside in.
Yeah.
But how do you maybe communicate to somebody that will buy every Call of Duty, regardless of how often they make the same game and rehash it? Or do we just leave those kind of people alone?
I think everyone can, because I think even people like that, if you talk to them, they're like, did you play Space Cadet Pinball? They're like, yeah, bro, Space Cadet! Like, they get really psyched about it. There's always going to be something like that. I don't think there's anyone who's exclusively only played like Black Ops their entire life. And I think, and even like some of the shooters I mentioned earlier, like, again, not that there's anything wrong with Call of Duty. I liked Modern Warfare 2, I actually really enjoyed it. But I'm a Halo player, not for any minute, but like, there's ways to bring them in to say this is an experience that's more familiar to you. There's a lot of stuff like this out there you've never heard of. There's a lot of games even like Call of Duty. I'm trying to think of one's coming to mind right now, but just there's always a place for someone to break in no matter what their interest is. And so finding the right thing for the right person, I think. With that, I think that's time. So, thank you.